Hello and welcome to Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about an aspect of narrative perspective, and that's the use of characters as a focus in a chapter or to help focus a chapter, and focalizing through a character and how that impacts narrative. And one of the reasons I want to talk about this is it seems to be almost ubiquitous now that a single chapter in a fantasy novel will be told from a single character perspective, almost mimicking sort of George R. R. Martin's structure, where this is a Sansa chapter, this is a Brienne chapter, this is a Cersei chapter, this is a Jon chapter. That now this is how fantasy stories are told. And of course, there are lots of different ways to tell a story, there are lots of different ways to narrate a story. And having a single character POV for a chapter is only one of them. But why is it so popular? Why do we like this? Why do authors like this? So I thought I'd talk a little bit about this to explain at least some of the reasons why it's a popular choice for authors, what effects that creates, and how there's actually a range of different techniques that they can use, even though it can look like the same thing, they're actually doing different things. And the difference, obviously, that I want to talk about is focusing on and focalizing through. But we'll get to that. So what do I mean by all of this? If you imagine a scene, and let's take, for example, The Lord of the Rings, and the scene in which Gollum / Smeagol is having an argument with himself, wakes up Sam, and Sam has, because he's pawing at Frodo, Sam gets upset. This wakes Frodo up, and Frodo sort of castigates Sam. And that whole sequence, we can view it as almost imagining the camera is sitting here. We see and hear Smeagol's dilemma as he is arguing with the alter ego Gollum. And that then wakes up Sam. Sam then comes into frame and accosts Gollum. That then wakes up Frodo. And what we have there is there isn't a single character point of view, because the character point of view is not just with Smeagol. It's not just with Sam, and it's not just with Frodo. If it was with Frodo, we wouldn't have seen any of the Sam and Smeagol interactions because Frodo was asleep. He couldn't have seen them. If it was with Sam, we couldn't have seen the Smeagol Gollum interaction because he was asleep at that point, but we would have gotten the rest of it. And if it was with Smeagol and Gollum, when he has gone off at the end of that sequence, we wouldn't have had the conversation between Frodo and Sam because Smeagol wasn't there for it. So what we have is it's like the scene is the focus and these characters are in it. So we are following the characters, but we are not focused solely on a single character point of view. And obviously, as I went through that sort of sequence, you can see if Frodo had been the character point of view, we couldn't have had the sequence at all. If Sam had been the character point of view, we'd be missing the Smeagol Gollum part. And if Smeagol or Gollum had been the point of view character, we'd have been missing the final interaction between Sam and Frodo because he couldn't possibly have heard it. So you can see how by picking a singular point of view, by picking a point of view character, it actually limits the amount of information that an author can narrate to a reader. And you sort of, well, why would an author choose this? Why would an author choose to limit themselves? And that is precisely one of the reasons why this is popular with certain authors. It provides a set of limitations to write against and to write with. It provides a structure where there is information that they cannot possibly give the reader, so it allows them to focus more on what they can give the reader. So it sort of helps focus them and their narrative into a certain direction. Now, obviously, that can lead to things like writing themselves into a corner. Like, how do we get across the important information that the whole Smeagol Gollum situation was to evoke in a reader? But of course, if Tolkien had been writing from, say, Frodo's perspective, he would have created a scene in which Frodo came across that, saw that from a distance, saw Gollum arguing with Smeagol. And that would be how it would be done to make sure to maintain fidelity to character perspective. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. Because when we have a point of view character, it limits the focus of the narrative to only the things that they can see, hear, that's in their field of vision, that's in their range of hearing, that they can smell, taste, and touch. And because of that, it provides a strong scaffolding with which an author can construct a scene, but also for a reader, because that is how we perceive the world. We perceive the world very much from a central perspective, looking out. When we find that in a narrative, when we find that everything is from one perspective, it is actually easier to read. It's easier to identify with. It's an ease of understanding the situation. And that is a very valuable tool for an author, because that increases the accessibility of a novel. Because suddenly now you are subconsciously or unconsciously building a link between how your reader is perceiving the world and obviously how the character is perceiving the world, which helps you consolidate a reader engaging with that particular aspect of the story and that particular character. And again, this leads into the next point. By having a singular point of view character for a chapter, there is a significant amount of page length developed to that character. The additional pages, the additional time spent with that character helps a reader identify with and come to know that character. If you have only a few pages across an entire novel to develop a distinctive character, that is an enormous challenge for an author. But if you have hundreds of pages to develop a character, that makes it a lot easier, because you don't have to be as dense with the information. You can feed it in slowly. You can have a much more expansive and slow development of who this character is, or have lots of examples of them doing something so that the reader can get used to it. And so it goes to ease of characterization. It is easier for a reader to get to know a character when they have huge amounts of page time. And it's a simple mathematical fact. So by having a central point of view character for a chapter, you authors are able to help encourage readers to not necessarily identify with, but to build a rapport with, to build an understanding of the character that is involved in the narrative. And that is incredibly useful, because when the character goes through something, when they go through a travail or some sort of problem, that allows you to ratchet up the emotional resonance that a reader might have, because now they are more invested in that storyline. And also we get to the point that it can make a narrative much more interesting, not only to create, but also to read. Because if you're telling a story from a position of this is the story and here are the characters in it, it can feel very depersonal. But if you have this character point of view, you are personalizing the narrative with a particular point of view. You're inviting the reader to follow along with it. And if you combine that with multiple other point of view chapters, much like Martin does in A Song of Ice and Fire, what you do is you create these character threads, these character arcs that run through the entire narrative, that each one is an individual arc, and they crisscross and interrelate to others, and other characters who may have points of view in other parts of the book can enter and interact into those scenes. But you have individual arcs, almost mini narratives, in which that character is the hero of their own story. And so you have all of these mini stories running all the way through. And then when they are taken in combination, when these threads are interwoven, it creates an entire narrative tapestry. And that tapestry may emphasize or de-emphasize certain elements. And one of the ways of thinking about this is that old story about the three blind men who are all trying to describe an elephant, and one is holding the trunk, one is holding a leg, and the other is holding the tail. So each one of them can complete their description, their character point of view, their arc. So the one describing the tail, and that's their arc. And it can be a very satisfying description. Same with the leg, the same with the trunk. But for the reader, because you have access to all three arcs, you now can construct a picture of the entire elephant. And so it actually allows authors to have these mini narratives running all the way through that may have their own individual themes, their own different sort of rising action and falling action, their different problems that they explore and explore in different ways. And all of that can be done individually and distinctly for each of these different character POVs and arcs. And then in combination, what you end up with as a complex narrative that is built from all of them is something different. And it can have, and it can emphasize different themes. It can emphasize different actions, things that were incredibly important to one character. We now view in a different light because we saw the actions of a different character looking at the same thing or looking at the ramifications. A character intended a good deed and they did a good thing that we agreed with at the time, but the ramifications ended up being terrible. We now see it from a different position. That's the usefulness of multiple POVs. And of course, you can have a single POV in a chapter, or you could have multiple POVs in a chapter. And again, it's all about playing with these different elements to create narrative effects. But of course, the more points of view that you include, the more you dilute that relationship that you are building between reader and character, or at least potentially dilute. It all depends on the narrative. And then from that, you can see that, yes, you're doing that, but you can create a more complex picture. The fewer points of view that you have, you can simplify the narrative. And you can understand why then, depending on the narrative that the author wishes to tell, that wishes to explore, wishes to narrate to us, their readership, why sometimes they go for a limited, very limited number of points of view, or they go for more points of view. And even why sometimes they choose that almost like a fixed camera position where there isn't a single point of view character, but there's sort of a group, and they choose within that group who they're going to follow. They're going to follow the action of the scene, not necessarily a single character. And again, these are all very valid ways to narrate the events, and they have strengths, they have weaknesses. So what I want to talk about now is the difference between character point of view and focalizing through a character. So when a chapter has a character point of view, if we think on one side, on the far end of this spectrum of what an author can do, the exposition is the exposition. What happens is what happens. That the narrative is told in a certain style, but the amount of information is going to be limited to what that character can perceive. And that's all that it is. The character point of view is there to limit the scope and scale and framing of the narrative sequence. And the character has no impact on the style of narration, on the language of the exposition. On the far side, on the opposite end of this spectrum, where you have focalization through a character, again, thinking about a single character perspective, and again, it's limiting the point of view. But now, how the character actually perceives the events will actually have an effect on and will impact the exposition. And a way of illustrating this is, it's an example I've used before. So Anthony and Bob go to see a sporting event, and two players clash on the pitch. And Anthony gets up and screams, "Ref, that's ridiculous. He should be sent off." And Bob stands up going, "What are you talking about? That's absolutely fine." And from that, you know, in the exposition, in the description of the event, it could say that the players clash. And what we have is Anthony, because he's saying the other person should be sent off, we get that he is a fan of Team A. And Team A was the one that basically came out worse in the clash. And Bob is a fan of Team B, and Team B won the clash, but might get now penalized for it. So the exposition, regardless of which point of view character we had, was going to be the same. There was this clash, and the reactions are there. So no matter who's describing it, no matter which point of view we are with, we're getting the same information. Now, if we focalize through a character and look at how they perceive the events, we can actually have a very different version of that very simple narrative. So for instance, if we focalize through Anthony, Anthony is a huge fan. He witnesses this clash, but what the author can do is instead of describing it as a clash between the two players, it will now be the player from team B viciously tripped the player from team A, because that's how Anthony sees the event. That's what he sees. His passion and support for one team, A, is causing him to view the event in the most negative light possible. And then when we switch to point of view focalization through Bob, what we see is he sees it as this was an accident. He went in for a tackle and it went wrong and it was an accident and it wasn't bad. And that reveals through his perception of the event that he is a supporter of Team B, but he will actually describe the event differently. He will focus on different things. He won't see it as a vicious trip. He will see it as an accident that was a result of, clean contact. So you can see by focalizing through the characters, what an author is able to do is in some ways destabilize the objective reality of the narrative. And this is a very, very common technique for unreliable narration and personalizing a narrative. Because again, if you've any experience with witness statements or people talking about the same event that they all witnessed, they'll all have slightly different memories. They'll all emphasize different things. And depending on how they feel maybe about the people involved, they may describe the event radically differently. And so when an author chooses to focalize through a character, it can actually not only change the language of the exposition, but also change the actual narrative event, because how they perceive it may be very differently to how someone else perceives it. They will all agree on the sort of the general facts. There was a clash between the two players, but in one instance, it was a vicious trip. And in the other instance, it was an accident. And this is such a common thing that we see in real life. You can understand why it is attractive to authors when they are writing in a novel, because it allows them to play with the perception of events. And of course, we see this it's been used quite effectively in a number of different films. Rashomon is one of the classic examples, where you have elements of the same events told from multiple perspectives. But each time there's additional information or a reframing of the information in a different way, which means that although each character is limited in what they see, and they have a particular perspective, the viewer or the narratee has the bigger picture, and they can see how each of the different characters, how their ideologies, their backgrounds, their personal prejudices and biases are influencing how they perceive the information. And they can see how they're getting to their decisions and how they're perceiving the events. And we get a general sense of what's going on, rather than this is the objective truth. And there are lots of films that do this. The Last Duel very recently played heavily with this. One Night at McCool's did this. Quentin Tarantino is very fond of this technique of using vignettes or character-centric stories that are focalized through the character, where the events overlap or are told from different perspectives that emphasize different aspects. So you can understand focalization through a character can have far-reaching implications for the actual narrative, because not only are narrative events potentially going to be different depending on which character is viewing them, but the actual exposition, what is on the page, will change to reflect that. And of course, we can then take sort of a middle ground approach here, just to illustrate this, that you don't need to go to either extreme. But you can imagine a character perspective in which, while the factual information is the same, the players did clash, dependent on which character the point of view is with, the language used to reflect that, even though they're not changing the sense of what happened or the interpretation of what happened, but they may choose different language to describe it. Joe Abercrombie does this quite a lot, where, say, Logan's chapters, the language of the exposition is subtly shifted to be more in line with Logan's character than when it's a Glotka chapter, in which case the language is shifted more in line with Glotka's character. What they perceive, how they describe things is slightly different because they are written from those character perspectives. But it's not fully focalized through them. There's not a radical departure in understanding what happened, but the language used is more in keeping with that character perspective. And it's a very subtle thing that creates a very distinctive sense of who the character is and provides a more immersive experience for a reader. So it's a really interesting technique. And you can see multiple ways that authors can deploy this as they desire, because they can have certain characters, or they could choose a character to heavily focalize through as a contrast to all of the other characters. Like, there's no one way to do any of this. Ian M. Banks' Fearsome Engine is a great example where the different character perspectives actually do very, very different things. And one of them is a sort of running external, internal monologue that is written in idiom and is a stream of consciousness narration, which is radically different to the others, but ties into what is going on in that novel. And it's really, really interesting. So that's one of the things that I really just wanted to highlight here, because we can talk about narrators and narrative perspective. We can talk about first, second, and third person, or past tense, present tense, unreliable and reliable narration. But when we get down to the nitty gritty, even something like a character point of view, there is nuance to be had with how a character point of view is being used and what effect an author is trying to achieve with that character point of view. And even something as the amount of time that you spend with a character can have an impact. So a limited number of points of view for a novel that is 600 pages long is going to have different effects when there are multiple or a lot of character points of view across the entire novel. Whether there's a fixed sort of camera viewing a scene and moving between the different characters as character focus, or whether it's a single character. All of these are different techniques. And it's not that any one technique is the best technique. An author is finding the technique that works for what they want to do for that scene to try and tell the story the best way possible. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you for your continued support. I really do appreciate it. I hope you're having a great new year, and I'll see you in the next one.